And this morning we talk with another historian, adjunct professor at Shepherd University, Dr. Steve Goldman.
The trick with Steve is to be able to hear through that thick Tennessee accent that he's got when he speaks.
Yes. Steve, what part of Tennessee did you and Bill Stubblefield grow up in together?
Queens.
Queens, Tennessee, yes.
Yeah. And we came out of it, Steve, talking the same way.
Yeah, I've met that many times, Bill.
That was good, John. I enjoyed that. Yeah. Welcome, Steve. Great to have you on the program again, sir.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, what have you been up to lately?
I've been trying to get my next book out. I've written several articles, most of which, by the way, are about Maryland history.
Yes.
And it's really interesting because not being, of course, now a proud Marylander, but I was not born in Maryland. And it's interesting to have the perspective of someone who was not from here originally and was not educated here in, through high school, to discover, first of all, the rich history of Maryland, but things that people who grew up here and were educated here didn't know about. So a lot of the focus I'm doing now is obviously Monocacy, which we'll talk about, but also the B&O Railroad and the 1864 election in which the state of Maryland, the only border state to do so during the Civil War, abolished slavery on its own, which is just a remarkable story.
I was not aware of that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's, this is, and I've done a deep dive into that. And again, as we'll talk about today, the first time I was on, the first words that all of us said was about a movie, if you remember, it was an Apocalypse Now reference. And it's the concept of the backstory. And I think one of the things that I try and do as a war historian and as a historian with very different training than most classically trained historians, I find the backstory is so interesting and also in many ways tells you things that other approaches to history don't necessarily do.
You do take approaches that historians don't typically take, and I give you credit for that, very much so, Steve. You have two appearances coming up in Frederick, nearby here, not too far away, on Saturday, June the 7th at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, which is a fascinating building, and on the 161st commemoration of the Battle of Monocacy, Saturday, July 12 and Sunday, July 13.
Yeah, two of my favorite venues. As a matter of fact, this will be my 14th appearance either at the Museum of Civil War Medicine or for the Museum of Civil War Medicine or at one of its other facilities, beginning in 1999. And it's a remarkable thing because I was there really from the beginning and the formation of that marvelous museum, as you're pointing out. And this talk that I'll be giving on Saturday, in some ways is a distillation of my ongoing research on not just the Civil War and Reconstruction, but on all veterans, up to and including now, because of what we've learned literally since the 1860s about what happens when men and women return from war and what they do in the society to which they return. And as you know, that's a great interest of mine, as I know of the three of you. We've discussed that before. So what I'll be doing at the Museum of Civil War Medicine will be really putting together my ongoing work on trying to, frankly, counter some myths and misconceptions about the men of the Union, black and white, and what they did after the war and the applications it has for now.
What time is your presentation on Saturday, June 7th at the Museum of Civil War?
At 3 p.m.
3 p.m. I finished recently watching Band of Brothers, that great series that was out in 2001. And toward the end, when they know the Germans are close to surrendering, it's about time to finally go back home. They start talking about what are you going to do when you get back home. And you mentioned that just a moment ago about leaving military service and going back home and transitioning from, in World War II's case, these guys were under heavy fire from the time they arrived on Normandy and until they eventually were able to leave and go home. And you're talking about a year's time of constant heavy stress, heavy fire, seeing your friends and colleagues blown up, killed, and such, and the survivor's guilt that goes along with that too, Steve. That wasn't unique to World War II or Vietnam. That's something that all of these veterans go through.
Well, that's absolutely true. And again, that last episode is called Points.
Yes.
As you remember, they have to accumulate points. But there's something that I go deeper into that, which actually I've been putting more and more into my writings and my talks, and that's the concept of survivor obligation. And survivor guilt generally morphs into survivor obligation. And that is the responsibility that one takes on when one survives war. And survival is a gift. And anyone who's been in combat, anyone who's been to war knows that it's a gift that one is given that was not given to others whom they leave behind. That's why, as I pointed out before, and I will reiterate, I never use the word hero unless it's in a quote, and I've never, ever heard anyone who's been to war ever refer to themselves as a hero. They only talk about anyone who did not return as a hero. Audie Murphy is a great example of that, and others. And that concept of survivor obligation absolutely epitomized by the men of the Union because of what they did during the decades following the Civil War when it came to working towards equality. And we've seen that in modern times. We saw that with, I mean, you mentioned watching Band of Brothers. I just finished rewatching the Vietnam War documentary, Ken Burns and Lynn Novick, which, by the way, is even better than I remember from 2017. And that entire 10-episode documentary, which, by the way, has no historians in it. The narrative is driven by some of the great Vietnam veteran writers, from people from North Vietnam, both Viet Cong and the MVA, South Vietnamese Army soldiers and others, war protesters. The film is remarkable. And what really comes through in that documentary is the impact that war had and continues to have on those of us who lived through that era, and trying to take lessons from what happened going forward. And by the way, many of the Vietnam veterans themselves talked about Civil War veterans as really setting the template. As I wrote about One More War to Fight, that's one of the themes of my book, is that the men of the Union, white and black, established the model for what veterans do in civilian life, particularly in a republic. And that's a tremendous, powerful motivator for positive things in one's society based on one's war service.
You know, it's interesting. I just recently, within the last few weeks, watched that Vietnam, the Ken Burns documentary for the first time. And you're right. I was completely gobsmacked by it. But what I found particularly interesting, the lack of expectation, particularly for the guys, like there's a tunnel rat in there that's,
yes,
meaning no disrespect, and some others, they had no expectation of survival. And there was one guy in particular, I wish I could remember his name, but he said something really profound. He said he only killed one human being. And after that, he only killed, and he used a lot of epithets for what they call the Viet Cong and the Vietnamese. And he killed a lot of them, but they were not human beings. And you can see that he's struggling with that concept now when talking to the producers of the documentary, because that's quite a shift for a civilized person to make.
Well, one of the things I'm going to be talking about at the Museum of Civil War Medicine is the concept of moral injury. And Dr. Jonathan Shea was one of the first to really look at that, and there's two marvelous books, one based on the Iliad, one based on the Odyssey. And Jonathan ran a PTSD unit, particularly for Vietnam vets, and his work is marvelous. And I've now incorporated more and more of discussing moral injury exactly for the point you're making as to how it could be avoided. And one of the great aspects about moral injury is looking at why you fought a war. And as I said before, and again will reiterate, valorous service in a cause that is not a cause one should or would be fighting for does not validate the cause. For the men of the Union, fighting initially to maintain the Union, and then even more magnificently fighting for freedom, and then after the war, fighting for equality, validated what they stood for. So again, I'm going to point out in my talk, and as I point out more and more in my writings, is that one of the reasons why I find little evidence among Union War veterans of moral injury is because of what they fought for, how they fought the war, their tremendous pride in having been soldiers, and the warrior identity associated with that. And that's a great point you're making, because again, the tunnel rat is not a pejorative. That's what they call themselves. And again, as a writer, one of the great writers in detective fiction is Michael Connelly, and Harry Bosch was a tunnel rat, and he's incorporated that into the evolution of Harry Bosch as a Vietnam vet into one of the finest detectives in Los Angeles, the LAPD. So there are elements in fiction when you're knowledgeable. There are elements in films when you're knowledgeable of the tremendous positive aspects of being a veteran, of using that experience to change society, to have support from people who will try to understand what you're trying to tell them, even things exactly as you're pointing out. And again, one of the things I was struck by rewatching the documentary was the tremendous honesty of the men who fought that war in explaining how they came to grips with it.
Yeah, Steve, you and Rob, when you were first made the introduction, you kept referencing the backstory. And what I have been most impressed with these interviews, this is the third or fourth one I think we've had, is how you've given me a glimpse upon another aspect of the war or the Reconstruction. We tend to think of stories about the war of a certain journal, a certain company doing this and that, but you concentrate upon the impact it had upon the local residents. In one case, all their wooden fences were torn up for fire. All their trees were cut down for fire. And so there was an impact for 4 or 5 years after that, long after the war, of having the local residents having to cope. Same thing with Reconstruction. I think in Tennessee, you had Jim Crow. You had individuals from D.C. that was put down as leadership, and the problem they were presenting. So I want to applaud you on this, Steve, because this is an aspect of history that rarely do we see, but it's an aspect of history that you're so adept at pointing out to us.
What can I say? I'm humbled because that's what I do, and the three of you have always been so tuned into that. Which brings me, by the way, to the talks I'm going to be giving at Monocacy. I've got some great new information about two of the most important people at Monocacy. One who is pretty well known and one who is probably unknown to most people. And that's the relationship between the commanding general, Lew Wallace, and David Clendenin, lieutenant colonel in command of the 8th Illinois Cavalry, who was not part of Wallace's army. He was in the Army of the Potomac. And I loved delving into these two men because they had never laid eyes on each other before they met, literally before the first battle. By the way, there were two battles at Monocacy. there was the battle north and through Frederick on July 7th, 2 days before the actual Battle of Monocacy at Monocacy Junction. And the two men, as I'll describe, had gone through tremendous adversity during the war. They both were citizen volunteers, and they exemplify how civilian volunteers can become, through adversity, command, combat, and frankly, character, to become as good as professional soldiers. And these two men, who formed a lifelong friendship, it is clear to me and to my friend Matt Porter's, and of course, his expertise at Monocacy, that without those two men being in command, and again, one complete happenstance that Clendenin and his men showed up at Monocacy, I can't conceive of them holding off Jubal Early's tremendous corps for 36 hours. And of course, as we know by extension, being vital to not only saving Washington's capture, but helping to save Lincoln's reelection, which was vital. So if you love the backstory, you're going to hear more, because it's how the two of them saw something in each other and performed remarkably at a battle nobody expected to fight. And leading predominantly, with the exception of the Sixth Corps veterans that came in, and actually Clendenin's extremely experienced cavalrymen, most of the soldiers in Wallace's tiny army, the Eighth Corps, most of them had never been in combat before, or if they had, it had been a couple of years. So it's truly a remarkable story. So again, Am, I appreciate the plaudits on using the backstory, but this will really be the backstory that people haven't heard before.
Steve, where did you find the information on these two?
That's a great question. As a writer, you'll appreciate this. Some of this stuff is out there, and it's like what happened with One More War to Fight. I found material about the political activism of the Union veterans that was out there, and for whatever reason, historians either weren't interested or didn't see it. Don't forget, I'm coming at history from a very different standpoint. I have treated men and women who've been in the service, who've been to war. My background, I'm not a trained historian. My background is very different, and I'm looking for the experience of combat. I'm looking for the experience of being a veteran. So I bring a different perspective, and I think because of that, I think I am tuned in. As Rob, as you were saying, I'm tuned into something that's different. And I always call myself a war historian, not a military historian, because with the exception of Monocacy, by the way, I rarely talk about individual battles or about strategy. I talk about the experience. I talk about the impact, as Bill pointed out. And that all comes together into what I'm looking for. And again, when I say, John, when I say I'm looking for material, I go by where the material leads me. I don't start out with a supposition before I see it. And I take a novelist's approach.
But also, Steve, if I may interrupt just a second,
sure.
You're a collector as well. You collect historical newspapers. I think you have over 500,000 copies of historical newspapers. Is that correct?
Well, it's not me. I use the two great online sources, Chronicling America, which is done by the Library of Congress, and this amazing website that a guy in upstate New York, bless him, continues to do. I mean, it's an absolute gold mine of contemporary newspapers, and I love the newspapers for two reasons. They're contemporaneous. I don't like to use retrospective information because memory distorts. And also the contemporaneous papers from the 19th century and early 20th century were absolutely terrific newspapers. The reporting was excellent. The writing was excellent. But it also tells you what people were thinking at the time. And I try very hard to use a chronological approach. And though I do utilize other historians' work, as you know, I don't generally use their interpretations alone. I use my background and interpretation, and I try desperately to use the words of the people I'm writing about. And as I did in One More War to Fight, and as I'm doing in hopefully the next 2 books that'll come out, I try and focus on individuals as emblematic of themes that I'm presenting. And I found it to be an approach that people really like, so I use it both in my talks, and I certainly use it in my writings.
Dr. Stephen A. Goldman is our guest here. Just to reset, make sure someone just tuning in knows who we are speaking with. Steve is an MD as well. And Steve, is it safe to say that your specialty has been treating soldiers in PTSD?
That's an aspect of it. I certainly have diagnosed and treated folks with, and not just PTSD. A war-related stress can manifest in different ways. But as you know, I also emphasize that the great majority of those who go to war do not manifest PTSD. I look very heavily at the warrior identity, and there's a whole new exciting literature, which again I'm going to be emphasizing, particularly at the Museum of Civil War Medicine, is called post-traumatic growth, which is not, by the way, this is not just about war. There's great literature on cancer survivors, Holocaust survivors, and others. That it's the old Nietzsche concept is that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And so this isn't a new concept, but it has been more conceptualized as how therapeutic it is. And as I'm sure, we're talking about the Vietnam series, Band of Brothers, and a series I thought was even better, you've heard me say this before, was The Pacific, which I thought was astonishing, based on 3 Marines, and of course the amazing works of Eugene Sledge. It's the concept of how you utilize what you've been through to grow as a human being, and then to utilize what you've learned about yourself through these experiences that are so unique to change your society, to show to people that, and again, that survivor obligation, to utilize what you've learned. And again, this is not just specific to war. First responders, those of us who worked in emergency rooms. These are the kinds of things we carry with us. And those of us, I'll be honest, I worked with patients with HIV before we even knew it was HIV. And I carry that obligation for the work I did from starting in 1979 as a medical student with people who died of a worldwide epidemic. I am a repository of the people who died to tell their story, to explain what happened, how we treated those people at NYU and other places. So this is not just confined to war. And again, as the Admiral, again, which I greatly appreciate, that's the viewpoint I bring to my study of war.
And Steve, on that note, we've got about 30 seconds left. You will be at the National Civil War Museum of Medicine in Frederick. And that is this Saturday. Your presentation begins at 3. Always great to speak with you. Let's catch up again in July before you make your next appearance in Frederick.
Oh, that would be awesome. And again, thanks so much. It's always wonderful to speak to the 3 of you.
Thanks, Steve.
Pleasure is ours.
Lots
Thank you,
of
sir.
fun.